Okay, well, I'm Lise Martin, the Executive Director of Women's Shelters Canada. Donc, je suis Lise Martin, la Directrice Générale d'Hébergement Femmes Canada, et je veux vous souhaiter la bienvenue au premier webinaire pour nos membres associés. I'd really like to welcome you. This is our first webinar for associate members. And as you know, our organization is fairly young. We're 4 years old, and one of our main objectives is to amplify your voices and to bring greater recognition to the shelter sector and the incredible work that you do. And essentially, having you as associate members enables us to do this with increased relevance and legitimacy. And so we really look forward to working together in the future to advance the work that we do, and to be able to provide various webinars throughout, eventually start communities of practice, and we also have, you may have read about it, a shelter exchange program, but I won't get into detail around that. Donc, comme vous le savez, un de nos objectifs est vraiment d'amplifier vos voix et d'amener une plus grande reconnaissance au travail incroyable que font les maisons d'hébergement. Et en vous ayant comme membres associés, ceci nous permet de faire notre travail avec une plus grande pertinence qui parle de façon très forte. Donc, pendant le webinaire, Caitlin va agir en tant que modératrice et il vous sera possible de poser des questions. Vous le faites en utilisant une boîte qui est à la droite de vos écrans. Et donc, les questions peuvent être posées en anglais ou en français. Et on va procéder de cette façon-là et on va arrêter à quelques intervalles pendant le webinaire pour prendre des questions. So we'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, and to ask your questions, you can do so in French or English. Please do so on the right of the screen, and we'll be stopping a few times during the webinar as well as at the end to take questions. So we are very fortunate to have with us today Catherine Babcock and Shannon Spencer-Brown. They will be leading this webinar. Catherine is the president of Babcock & Company, and she has raised tens of millions of dollars for women's organizations in her role as Vice President, Strategic Initiatives, Canadian Women's Foundation. And Catherine has also been working as a consultant with Women's Shelters Canada for several years now. And Shannon Spencer-Brown is the Executive Director of the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation, Canada's largest public foundation dedicated exclusively to supporting women's shelters and domestic violence. And Shannon is also a partner of Women's Shelters Canada. The Royal LePage Shelter Foundation are supporters of sheltersafe.ca, which is a tool that we created in 2015, and by and large, thanks to the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation contributions. Donc, Shannon est directrice générale de la fondation Un toit pour tous de Royal LePage, la plus importante fondation canadienne vouée exclusivement au soutien des centres d'hébergement pour femmes. Et la fondation, et Shannon est partenaire avec Hébergement Femmes Canada, elle continue à appuyer hébergementfemmes.ca et nous en sommes très reconnaissantes. Et Catherine, donc, elle est présidente de Babcock & Company, une entreprise spécialisée dans l'innovation en matière de financement. Et elle a récolté des dizaines de millions de dollars pour des organisations de femmes au Canada à titre de vice-présidente à la Fondation canadienne des femmes. Et depuis quelques années, Catherine a travaillé avec Hébergement Femmes Canada en tant que consultante. Donc, je vais leur passer la parole et je vous souhaite tous un bon webinaire. So I will pass the word on to Catherine and Shannon, and I wish everyone a good webinar.
Thank you so much. It is my absolute pleasure to be here today as part of the first Women's Shelters Canada fundraising webinar, and it's particularly a privilege to be able to do so with Shannon Spencer Brown, who has thought deeply and worked in this space for a long time and is both a colleague and a friend. So thank you for this opportunity. And I want to take a moment before we begin to acknowledge all of you who are on this webinar, to acknowledge the work that you do and the expertise that you bring. This webinar is going to be general in nature, given the varying degrees of experience around the table, but there is going to be nothing that I say that at some level you don't already know, and I look forward over time to be learning from you in terms of what's working in your own contexts. What I'm going to be sharing is some fundraising best practice and some observations having been in the sector, and look forward to creating a community of practice around fundraising for one of the most important causes of the day. So I want to start with the first slide of a person watering a tree, and this was chosen beyond the wonderful idea of having a money tree in our backyard that we can go and collect from. It actually is a very profound metaphor for how fundraising works and where we need to put our focus. And that, quite simply, is at the base, where if you permit me the metaphor, that if seeds are planted in fertile soil that continues to be watered and nurtured, that the money tree will flourish. And the stronger the roots, the more fertile the soil, and the more attentive we are, the more the money will grow. And it cannot help but grow. And hopefully the process is as enjoyable as is seen on the image here, where this person looks extremely happy to be watering the money tree. So that's the context, and I will be drawing on this metaphor as we go. So I'm just moving us forward. So the great news about fundraising is it's really, really simple. All you need to do is find people or institutions that have money and then ask them for it. The skill is just in the finding of the people with money and in persuading them to happily part with it to support the cause. But at its essence, it's very, very simple. Not easy, but very simple. And so what I'd like to do today is to just give a little bit of a donor landscape in Canada to put the work that shelters are doing in a fundraising context, and then to talk about positioning for this fundraising success. Building those skills of how to find people and how to persuade them, building those out to be more robust. And then Shannon will walk through a case study and really bring some of these principles to life, coming from the perspective of one of Canada's largest corporate donors to shelters, which will illuminate some of these pieces. So first I want to start with putting Canada in context around giving behavior. So this is a study that is done by the World Giving Index, and it's a Gallup survey of 140 countries. And the year that this was done, Canada ranked 3rd in the world as one of the most charitable nations. And this is measured by a percentage who donate money to charity, who do volunteer work, who helped a stranger. So the takeaway from this, which is that the soil in Canada is fertile vis-a-vis other countries and within the country as a whole, that there are 66% of respondents who are donating to charity, and that comprises the majority. And so we have lots to work with. There are 170,000 charities and nonprofit organizations in Canada, and 85,000 of these are registered charities. What I want to illuminate with this, which I find fascinating, is that there are fewer than 500 charities in Canada that generate more than $1 million from corporate and individual sources. 80% of charities are raising $500,000 or less from these sources, and so but the large players in the space do generate substantial revenues. But most of us are working in charities where we are responsible for raising $500,000 or less, and there are 85,000 of us who are issuing tax receipts. But one of the things that I want encourage you to think about is that although as an individual shelter we might be raising less, you know, raising $100,000 a year or $500,000 a year or less than, as an aggregate across shelters, we are raising millions and millions and millions of dollars from individuals and corporations. And to really think about ourselves as a mini sector within a larger sector. And the charitable sector, this is both charities and nonprofit organizations, is actually quite a force to be reckoned with in Canada. And this interesting infographic actually shows us being second only to the energy sector in Canada in terms of the number of jobs that are involved and the percentage of GDP. So I think that this is an interesting context in terms of the work we do as an individual charity within the larger landscape. One other thing I want to say though around this landscape and where we are in the world right now, it is true that Canadians are generous. It is true that we have a very robust and advanced sector vis-a-vis other countries. And there's also a global trend that's happening in terms of women awakening to their philanthropy and their capacity, and women as a whole have more resources at their disposal at any time in history. So again, going back to the metaphor, the soil is really fertile. So the revenue that would come to shelters, obviously, to come to any charity, it comes broadly from two sources. The first is institutions, so foundations, corporations, and the second is individuals. And I first want to take a look at the individual donor landscape in Canada. So this is data based out of 2013, and one of the trend lines is that over time this amount increases. But what this demonstrates is that there's 24 million donors already in play in Canada, totaling $12.8 billion with an average gift of $500. If you look at the pie chart below in terms of in billions of dollars, $1.6 billion a year is going to social service agencies, and that's where the part that shelters would be fitting into. And then and a piece around that women are more likely to give to a charitable or nonprofit organization. It's not a huge differential, but it's interesting nonetheless. And older Canadians tend to give more on average. So this is just a snapshot of the individual giving landscape. But I do want to say around individual giving, although the $12.8 billion can seem like a large amount of money, what we're really interested in is growing the pie and having a bigger piece of the pie, but with it growing it. And so I go back to the idea that of this $12.8 billion, for sure, people who are motivated to give to social services would also be motivated to give to shelters, but there's also an opportunity. There's nothing to say that we couldn't live in a country where Canadians donated $24 billion or $36 billion, because this amount of money represents about 0.1% of assets that Canadians hold, so there's lots of capacity in the market. I'm going to move now quickly to corporate donor landscape, and I appreciate that this is a lot of information, but the slides will be made available, and I just want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, the kinds of corporate giving, that it's cash, goods and products, and services. And then there's that whole piece in corporate giving around employees and funds collected from employees. And Shannon is certainly going to bring that to life when she talks about the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation. But I want to talk briefly about marketing and supply chain, which is also ways that companies give. The cause marketing piece tends to be for larger charities who have a capacity to drive marketing and sales. So it's really linked to aligning with a cause in order to drive sales. So that would be like the pink ribbon breast cancer promotion, and it tends to be more sophisticated, although I do think that there are opportunities for shelters as an aggregate to be involved in cause marketing. And then the other thing is supply chain, collected money from customers and suppliers. And one of the largest campaigns in Canada that raises money for shelters, which was originally called Shelter from the Storm, which involves Winners and HomeSense, which many of you might be familiar with, is what would be called supply chain fundraising, in terms that it's money that is collected from customers and suppliers. And companies, and in this case, do shelters and the sector a huge, huge service by allowing them to be a platform and having their sales representatives ask for the donation. But that's what's understood as supply chain fundraising. And in terms of the total value of contributions, I will leave you to look at this in more leisure, but certainly social services ranks, and it is supported through all across all of the corporate giving types of donations. If you put the donor by type together, individuals give about 5 times what companies give, and both, though, are on an upward trajectory over time. There might be dips, and you can see those dips in this case in terms of when the recession hit, but over time they will be increasing. And again, when you're looking at this slide, just to keep in mind, these are only donations that are receive charitable tax receipts. So they don't capture all of the billions of dollars that Canadians spend attending special events, and they don't include all of the lotteries and other pieces. So these are just charitable tax receivable gifts. But interesting nonetheless in terms of giving a broad scope. So in thinking about the broader context, so Canadians are among the most generous people in the world, and women are even more, are more likely to donate than men, and women have more resources at their disposal. So we're in a very fertile soil context. The question is, how do we best position ourselves to increase our part of the donor pie, or better yet, to increase the pie? And I wanted to walk through the donor motivation piece. So fundraising success is absolutely tied, as you know from your experience, to giving donors what they want. So the impetus on us is always to sit in the donor seat and apply the what's in it for me principle. And it's not that people are self-serving. It is that we all come from a place of about looking at and needing to be motivated to be involved. And so the motivations for individuals, again, these don't apply to all individuals, but broad strokes, is that they want to make a difference, for meaning. And in my view, one of the gifts that we can give people as fundraisers is the opportunity for deep meaning in their lives, to be part of something, the creation of something that they cannot be a part of without connecting into a larger community. And so individuals are motivated by this desire to make a difference and to have meaning, and even I would call it transcendence. Sometimes I comment, that we are in the business of enabling people to be happy, because because generosity and the ability to be part of something that really matters, that is beyond you, is one of the fundamental ingredients to meaning. And there's been lots of research around that and happiness. And in addition to wanting to make a difference, many people are motivated by wanting to be recognized for making a difference. Again, there's a lot of research about how the imperative of being recognized by our peers and having stature amongst the people that we care about and being appreciated. This is not true for everyone in terms of how they would like to be recognized, but I have never met a donor who is not appreciative of being appreciated, whatever that means for that donor. And again, we're in the position in Canada of being able to give charitable tax receipts to honor people's philanthropic choices. And it has been said that outside of the ballot box, philanthropy is the greatest vote for the kind of world that we want. And we are able to give tax receipts, which is lovely. In terms of corporations, it's very similar in terms of what's motivating them, but there are some additional dimensions that I'm sure most of you, or if not all of you, are very familiar with. So the first is that corporations, being comprised of people, want to make a difference. And this difference is something that resonates throughout the company. And then they want to be recognized for making a difference. So this is both about the human need to be appreciated and recognized amongst their peers, but it's also further a halo effect in terms of if they want people to feel, they want current customers to feel good about what they're doing, and also ideally they want new customers to come to the table in appreciation for what they're doing. They also have the dimension of wanting to engage employees and charities to enhance team building. So this is a basic retention piece. And increasingly, especially in the millennial context, employees want to be involved in a bigger picture piece. Other considerations for corporations are cause alignment and return on investment. And the larger the gift and the more strategic the investment, the more that these come into play. So the piece around motivation is really critical, and what I like to use as the example of if I were to offer you a pen and say, this is $1,000, this pen, would you like this pen for $1,000? Nobody would take me up on it, especially if it's a little Bic pen. So I'd say, this is $1,000 for this pen? No. But if I were to say I have a Mercedes-Benz outside and it's $1,000, I would be stampeded as people were trying to get to the Mercedes-Benz. So the question is not if you have the $1,000, because clearly you do. It's about the perception of value. And that really is what the persuasion piece is about in terms of making the case, which we'll come to. But just prior to that, I want to put shelter fundraising in context. Because although the amount is variable across shelters, almost every shelter in Canada needs to raise funds outside of government support. So given that reality, the impetus is to get as good as we possibly can in terms of doing this piece. And what's exciting is that Women's Shelters Canada, as part of a national survey, is collecting more precise data on this. And what would be wonderful is if we could start to build a community of practice for members, sharing the information about how we fundraise and how we can best learn from each other, because there is exceptional fundraising being done by shelters across all types of revenue pieces, and I think that we can learn more from each other than we can from any external source. And despite where each of us are at, and there's overall commonalities about the strengths and challenges of shelters in the marketplace, and I want to touch on this briefly. The one is that shelters have a great advantage of being local. And you're also able to demonstrate an immediate community impact. And most companies and many individuals want to know that they're helping their own neighborhoods. You're also uniquely equipped with volunteer engagement opportunities by virtue of having bricks and mortar and programs and actually having a presence on the ground. And of course, the issue is profoundly resonant. It is, it's why we're all here. It's the heartbeat behind what we do every day, and it's an issue that resonates deeply with Canadians around the safety and well-being of women and their children. Some other fundraising advantages as a sector is that you're an emergency response, and that has an urgency that serves the fundraising asks. And you also exist within an ecosystem of shelters who all have to fundraise and all are doing really like varying degrees, interesting and different dynamic testing things, and there's an opportunity to learn from each other. And the other piece, by virtue of being local, you have an ability to create signature local business opportunities that connect with small businesses and local businesses that often are left out of fundraising campaigns because they don't have the sophistication of having specific corporate philanthropic budgets. Some of the challenges is the resources to do fundraising. Shelters, of course, were not created to fundraise. It's a necessary evil, some would say, or a necessary function of a shelter in order to bridge the gap to what's required. But it really does, to do it well, requires dedicated resources in terms of staffing, execution, and stewardship. So that's one of the challenges. A second one, specific to companies, is that they often prefer national alignments, although there are examples such as the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation and Winners Home Sense where they have national alignments, but that frees up local partnership opportunities. But it is difficult for a single shelter to go to a national corporation, and they would prefer it having been done as an aggregate. So that is the kind of the context, and with all that with context, I want to go back to kind of the simplicity of fundraising about how to find the people with money and ask for it, because again, that's the simple piece. But I just want to pause in terms of this context piece and ask if there are any questions.
All right, hi Catherine, it's Caitlin here, and I don't see any questions coming in at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, if anyone has questions throughout, they can type it in, and I'll let you know at the end of your session.
Okay, great.
Great.
So let's go back to the simplicity of fundraising, because again, compared to creating social change, this is simple stuff. So, and the good news is, no matter where we are in terms of the fundraising, how much fundraising we have done to date, we have some kind of what I call a fundraising ecosystem. And we can all build from where we are. And we know from fundraising that the place that people who give to you are you're most likely to give you more, and they're absolutely your ambassadors to bring people like them. So it's imperative to understand who are your current donors, why do they give, and how do they like to be recognized. And this is a terrific way of engaging your donors, is to, you know, if you have 1,000 individual donors or 100 individual donors, to reach out to 20 of them personally and have a conversation. Thank them for their gift, ask them why they give, and is there something more that can be done to recognize them and what is meaningful. And coming out of that, you'll not only be ensuring that they feel appreciated and recognized, but you start to get a clear picture of what motivates the donors that you currently have, because then you just need to replicate that kind of person and that kind of motivation to build out what you have. And the second piece in terms of building from where you are is which revenue streams have the highest return on investment. And this is something that that often we as charitable organizations have fallen into doing certain kinds of fundraising, and often we don't look at the full picture of the return on investment. So when I'm talking about return on investment for an event, for example, it's like not just what is the costs versus the revenue in terms of how, but in terms of all the staffing time, in terms of so it could be that, you know, you spend $100 on it, $1,000 on an event, and it raises $2,000, but it's taking $5,000 of somebody's staffing time, and in that case, it would be a negative return on investment. And there are tools, which I'm happy to send to you, links to them, around looking at the return on investment in terms of revenue streams. But it's important to just take some time to understand where you're at and which ones are providing you the best return on investment. So it might be that you've always done a direct mail, but that time, the return could be better directed in terms of staffing time and the allocation of costs against that to approach corporate donations. So the other thing I'll say about this is that you often can increase the return on investment for an event by overlaying other pieces. So for example, if you have an event, it is a fantastic opportunity to do an ask from the podium for those people to become individual donors, and you can go ask a company in your city to match those donations at the event. And so there's a way of which, given that these are already fixed costs that you're doing, is there a way that you can layer it so that there's more revenue coming in from those pieces? So once you understand unpack the donors and understand that your current donors, how they like to be appreciated and what's working well in terms of your revenue streams and how you can make them more efficient, then we're ready to roll in terms of the fundraising toolkit and going out and getting increasing the donations. So the first tool in there are only two tools really in the fundraising kit. One is a compelling case for support, and the other is donor recognition. So a case for support is simply why do you need the money and how much do you need? And many of you have done this in many iterations. But typically a case for support is it's an organizational document that contains a lot of your vision and mission, your existing programs, your staff and your leadership, financial information, rationale for services. Like, it's more of a business document, examples, but that looks at overall what is the organization, why does the organization exist, and what is the gap, and what will the impact of that be? And again, amongst shelters, there's some of you who have done absolutely beautiful work about making this case and about demonstrating the impact. But the more compelling this is, the better. And one of the things that I find helpful to remind myself of is that although this consumes my attention and it matters so much to me, I am a tiny walk-on part in a donor's life. They have a zillion other things going on. And so the more precise and compelling I can be, and to speak in their language, one of the things that I have found over the years is that many case for supports are not written for their audience. So it's not me I'm writing for a donor. And so testing the case for support is critical. And it's also an amazing opportunity to engage volunteers. And one of the groups of volunteers out there in the community that I really feel is underutilized are entrepreneurs. Because entrepreneurs do what fundraisers do every day. They have a good idea, especially early stage entrepreneurs. They have a good idea and they don't have the money, and they need to go out to the market to get that money. And so if you can find some successful entrepreneurs in your community and say, you've done this so well, I would like to test this case for support with you and tell me how you would change it, is a wonderful way of engaging them in the process. There is a famous line in fundraising that says, when you ask for money, you get advice, and when you ask for advice, you get money. And so just to use that and get as much advice in every step of the process in terms of fundraising. And again, you're not the audience for the case for support, as I mentioned. The second piece is around donor stewardship and how to recognize your donors and how to engage them with the work. And I'm going to leave that for Shannon to talk more about in her her piece because I'm conscious of time. The next piece is around finding new donors, and this is again back to the simplicity of fundraising, to find people and institutions with money and ask them for it. So once you know what you need, the kind of things that will resonate for corporate and individual donors that you want to go after based on what resonates with the corporate and individual donors you currently have, and through getting more advice, then it's really about becoming very skilled at finding new donors. And what's exciting is even in the last couple of years, there's been a momentous increase in the ability to map out people's networks through tools like LinkedIn. And I'll just take you through this chart and speak to it briefly, and then again, I'm happy to answer any questions. So your donors are in this triangle in the middle, and they are coming together of ability, affinity, and access. So ability is that somebody has money. Affinity is that they care about the issues. And access is about your ability to go and to reach them. In my experience, access is the most important quadrant to focus on. And a way of starting in terms of like inventorying all of your access points is to take all of your board of directors, all of your volunteers, all of your current donors, all of your suppliers, every single person you write a check for who provides any kind of service to your shelter, to take all of those and to map them into LinkedIn. Find out who they know and match those up against any companies or businesses or people that you have identified as having ability. And then the affinity can grow. And one thing that I want to say around affinity is what I've learned over the years is that there are lots of people who care deeply about the safety of women, and have an affinity to that, but might not have an affinity to the women's movement or might not have an affinity to feminism, but are profoundly generous around the issues of safety and children and women. And it's about, again, finding the bridging work that can bring them into the affinity. So, but to me, my experience is that the shelter affinity is very clear. I mean, that's almost universal in terms of people's recognizing the value, the importance of it. And the ability to give, of course, it's not everybody, but we know 24 million Canadians are donating already. So there's lots of people with both ability and affinity, and it really rests in terms of being masterful around the access point. And there are some great ways to start to learn that, and the access points are all going to come from understanding where you currently are and what you have in your ecosystem. So with that, it is my great pleasure to reintroduce Shannon from the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation to talk about this and animate it from the inside of a company that does this work.
Thank you, Catherine. And maybe, Caitlin, should we just do a quick little pause? Can you let us know if you have any questions for Catherine before I jump in?
Yeah, I don't see any questions at the moment, but we can check in again after your presentation.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to Women's Shelters Canada and to Catherine for allowing me to give a few examples from my experience with the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation. And as Lise mentioned earlier, or you may have seen in my profile, I'm a professional fundraiser, but now I'm on the sort of flip side of being a funder as well. But I'm going to encourage you to think about my example as being representative of maybe other corporate donors that you have or you aspire to having, or employee groups in the community, or companies in the community that have employee groups who you would like to work with, who have worked with you, or just the general concept of a third party providing support for your shelter, whether it's through an event or by providing donations. So I'm going to just dive right in, and Catherine is going to be continuing to advance my slides. So I may just say, Catherine, move ahead. So let me tell you a little bit about the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation. As mentioned, we are the official corporate charity associated with the real estate company Royal LePage, and we've been doing this work since 1998. Roughly, we're the largest public foundation in Canada dedicated exclusively to supporting women's shelters and violence prevention programs. And our realtors do this work really because, you know, they realize that a house is really only truly a home if the people who live there feel safe and loved and respected and accepted. And sadly, we know in instances of domestic violence, that's not the case. So we've raised $24 million since our inception, and our model is at 100% of what we raise, whether it's through donations or through fundraising events hosted by our realtors, goes to our partner charities, whether that be shelters or others that I'll speak to in a moment. And that's because Royal LePage Canada as a company funds any of our administrative or operating costs. And again, our model is to stay local. So if you're a shelter in Fort McMurray who may be on the line, for example, the Royal LePage office in Fort McMurray would be your partner. So anywhere across Canada where a Royal LePage office exists, we try and encourage those realtors to support their local shelter, and we facilitate that partnership. We have about 200 shelters that we're supporting, as well as other support programs that focus on helping women and children who've experienced domestic violence. We also fund violence prevention programs and teen healthy relationship programs with our longtime partner, the Canadian Women's Foundation, through the annual violence prevention grants. And we're also really proud to be a national partner with Women's Shelters Canada, and in particular the Shelter Safe website that Lise mentioned earlier. And if there just happens to be anybody on the call who does not have their shelter currently mapped or displayed on the Shelter Safe website, I'd highly encourage you to speak with Caitlin or Lise after the conference, after the webinar, and make sure that your shelter is located. It's a great way of raising awareness of the shelters in the community across Canada. And again, I've kind of already spoken with how it all works, but basically we match Royal LePage offices with their local shelter, and agents make commission donations, which is what we call their kind of payroll donations. So if you think about other companies in the community who you may have an opportunity to benefit from getting support from, they may have the idea of taking workplace or employee payroll donations in support of your shelter. And of course, our realtors also organize fundraising events. And we have a national signature event, our National Garage Sale for Shelter, which just took place this past weekend in about 60 communities across Canada. And we have our realtors participating in what we call the Challenge for Shelter fundraising treks. We went to Machu Picchu in 2015, and we're about to go to Iceland in the next couple of months. And these events will raise money, 80% for their local shelter, 20% to our violence prevention work. And we anticipate raising about $500,000 again this year through the Iceland Challenge for Shelter. And our realtors, I think we really also try and help them to raise awareness as well as funds in support of local shelters. We have programs that are a bit more cause marketing. We have a program called Shelter Blooms, where we're giving our realtors the ability to plant special tulips that then obviously bloom in the spring, and then to plant a sign to say, display a sign to say these shelter blooms are in recognition of women and children experiencing domestic violence. And of course, our offices also provide tangible items, and I'm sure many of you have corporate or business partners that provide in-kind support like toiletries, etc. And I just wanted to show you just a few fun photos. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but just to show that, you know, our realtors are really passionate about the cause. As Catherine referred earlier, that affinity to the cause is there. You can move forward, Catherine. And just like other companies in the community, I'm sure that they do all sorts of great great events in support of shelters, just like our realtors do. So I'm going to talk to you about sort of the best practices that I've seen shelters do when it comes to working with us as a foundation, but representative of, again, corporate donors or employee groups. So some of the things that I've seen done that really work well that I would highly encourage you to do is, make sure that you build a relationship with whoever the corporate champion is. The champion isn't going to be necessarily the president of the company. The champion might be, the front desk receptionist in a real estate office who is rallying the folks in that company to get behind the cause. So make sure you figure out who that champion is in that company or that business and aim to build a relationship with them. You can do that, in big ways life through just open communication. You know, call them, write to them, send them your newsletters, offer to visit them, offer to have a guest speaker come and speak at their weekly meeting, and if possible, again, I know it's not the case everywhere, but you know, offer to provide a tour. If you ever do sort of an open house for the community, make sure that they're invited to come in and see the shelter if at all possible, and just you know, bridge that gap between, and again, to create that affinity that Catherine mentioned earlier. This is really, really critical. Group volunteering opportunities are great. A lot of companies have, you know, days of caring or volunteer days. Again, you may or may not be able to bring them into the shelter, but if you ever do have an opportunity, it's a great way to build engagement with corporations or businesses to get them volunteering. One example, one of the shelters here in Toronto did an off-site Christmas party a number of years ago, a holiday party, and we had a bunch of volunteers from our Royal LePage head office here go and help set up the toy and gift boutique for the families at that event, and it was a really great bonding experience. And oftentimes when companies give those kinds of volunteering opportunities through your shelter, that just builds affinity and makes them more likely to also make financial contributions. You probably know this, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but make sure you thank your donors regularly and explain how the funds are used. And in particular, share your stories. I'm grateful to many shelters who we approach on a regular basis. We do a donor newsletter quarterly, and we will repurpose some of the amazing stories that you're telling in your newsletters, obviously with your permission. But we want to make sure that our donors feel really connected to the women and children who are helped. So make sure you thank your donors regularly, whether it's, you know, through a personal card or a letter or a newsletter, and as much as possible use donor-centered language. By that I mean, you know, it's not as meaningful for me to read a newsletter that says we ran 3 parenting programs and gave away you know, 20 backpacks full of, you know, school supplies. What is meaningful is to hear me or hear you say, because of your support, you have helped, you know, women to move on to job success, and you've helped children to integrate successfully into their local school. You've given them the courage and you've given them the hope to move on. And so that real donor-centered language that you have helped, not we as a shelter have done X, Y, Z, that's really meaningful for donors, and many of you are doing that really well. So I encourage you to keep doing that. You know, another way of kind of keeping that open communication, I would say, you know, stay in touch and update your donors regularly on the shelter's needs. Recently, a shelter sent out this beautiful email request or an email saying that they were having 3 babies, newborns, coming to the shelter in the coming months. There were 3 women currently in the shelter who were pregnant, and they were going to do kind of like a baby shower and had a gift registry for those women. And it was just a great quick update on the immediate needs that shelter has, and I know that resonates really well with many donors. Switching to events, you know, remember to offer all of your corporate partners the opportunity to sponsor your events, and be really flexible with that. You know, don't stick to the, you know, platinum, gold, silver, bronze, you know, categories of sponsorship. You know, maybe you have a corporate partner who wants to, you know, sponsor the centerpiece, or sponsor, again, you know, a matching gift opportunity like Catherine referred to earlier. Just be creative, and if you've already established a really good working relationship with your corporate donors, together you will co-create something that's meaningful both for them and for you. And of course, hopefully, you know, make sure you invite them to all of your events, AGMs, open houses, etc. In a different realm, again, sometimes, you know, back to that comment about asking people for advice that turns into money, you know, involve your more engaged corporate partners or business partners in any advocacy efforts. If you're going to do a capital campaign and you're seeking, you know, funding support from the government, absolutely get, you know, your corporate donor to write a letter endorsing your advocacy efforts, because that's meaningful when government funders see that, you know, that we're all in this together. If you have board positions or senior volunteer roles, again, make that known to your corporate donors. And if you have individuals individual donors who work for companies, make sure that they share with you opportunities for corporate matching gift opportunities. So if you have somebody who works for, who works for a local oil company, for example, if their corporation, their company offers a matching gift opportunity, that's a way of engaging your individual donors to bring in their companies, and vice versa. Remember that any of your corporate donors could down the road become individual donors. So in other words, let's say potentially they are either still in that workplace or they've moved on to a new workplace. They may want to become an individual donor. So think of them in those terms as well. So what not to do, just kind of wrapping up, what not to do with corporate donors and employee groups. So these kinds of things are not going to serve you well. So forget that they have different motivations for giving at times. Forget that they sometimes might want to have marketing opportunities or kind of quote unquote look good to the customer, or they want to involve their employees. In other words, remember that they have those things in mind. Don't give them opportunities to volunteer as a group. That'll unfortunately not strengthen the relationship. Moving on, Catherine. So yeah, don't forget that corporations have budget planning cycles, and so you might want to ask them if they have any particular times of year when you can or cannot go to them for funding requests. The next one is a really big one for anybody who has sort of industry-specific companies that they are involved with, corporate donors, banks, real estate companies. Here's a big faux pas is, asking the competition first. So in my case, if you have a Royal LePage realtor or a Royal LePage company supporting you, make sure you ask them first to get involved with your event sponsorship before potentially bringing in a new real estate partner. It's not to say that you shouldn't involve the entire community in your efforts. Just be kind of cognizant of some of those little political things that you might experience. And don't bother thanking them or explaining how the funds have been used. And I can tell you, again, that's a real no-no. If you don't share with them how they've made a difference, you're going to unfortunately preclude yourselves from getting future gifts. And lastly, final word on corporate donors and employee groups, and then we can open it up in case there are any questions. While corporate donors or businesses may have different reasons for supporting your shelter that have to do with their business, promoting their business, companies are made up of individuals, and as we've heard from the very beginning of this webinar, individuals do tend to give the most money to charity. So remember that companies are made up of individuals, and remember those human reasons for giving. The last point on this is that companies, just like individuals, you have to touch people's hearts and minds. There's been a lot of research around how people make donor giving decisions, and it's kind of that, people want to give from their heart. They are touched by emotional stories and they want to make a difference, but you also need to give them a reason for their mind to make that giving decision. So both the head and the heart have to be aligned in order for you to be successful at fundraising, whether approaching individuals or corporate donors. And what's so wonderful about women's shelters is that we have the ability to do that. We have the ability to express the life-saving programs that you're offering women and children and generations of families to come, but you're also making a difference on an economic level around saving sort of the overall costs to our society, financial, by saving women or experiencing safety, I should say, providing safety for women and children in the community. So that's all that I have in terms of my case study, and I hope that, again, you can use it to kind of think broadly about business or corporate partners that you have in your communities.
Thank you so much for that, Shannon. And just prior to opening it up for questions, I want to finish by saying that the number one reason that donors donate, the number one reason that people give to charity is because they were asked. And in my experience, it's often hard to ask. And although I talked about it being a very simple process, it is simple but not easy because it's difficult to ask sometimes. It's hard to face rejection or to be turned down. And so I think alongside of the skills of fundraising, the cultivation of courage, is really important, and to go outside of our comfort zones in order to bring women into to allow women to have more comfort in their lives. And the sometimes when I'm afraid to make a call, to make an ask, to put myself out there, I think about the quote from Audre Lorde, and it's really profound for me, and I want to leave it with you. It's that when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. So thank you for all that you do.
So Catherine, do you want to just put it on the last slide for contact info if anyone needs to write that down? We will also be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar, and we can also send a link to the Google Docs of the presentation so people can have the slides if they need to. We have one question here. Catherine, it says, I think you're still on mute, just so you know.
Yeah.
There you go. Catherine, the question is it best to ask by letter first, followed up by a request to meet?
Yeah, so it's a great question. In my experience, anything that's put in written form, other than direct mail, but actually like for major gifts or companies, anything that you put in writing is at the end stage of the process. It's the final piece. So it is, unless there's a very structured way in which a company only wants online applications, but really the strength is in relationships. People give to people. And so the ability to have somebody in your fundraising ecosystem that can introduce you to somebody, a donor, and then to have a coffee with them is ideal, and then follow it up with a request based on both what you need as a shelter, but what you understand their motivation to be, so that you can put it into their language and frame it in a way that will resonate with them. So the proposal or the letter with a specific request is always the last piece, unless, again, it's highly structured and they only want online proposals, in which case it's different. But if there's any element of relationship building, it makes it much, much stronger in terms of the outcome.
Great, so we have a couple more questions coming in. Catherine, the next one is, can you explain how to leverage donor lists on LinkedIn?
Sure. So it's a simple process of taking a donor name and putting it into LinkedIn for your shelter or for you personally, your personal LinkedIn. So if you're the manager of a shelter and you have your own LinkedIn page, then you put in the donor's name and you say, thank you so much for supporting the shelter. I would love to link in with you professionally. And then once they accept that, and they might not accept it, but assume that they do, then you have a little icon on their thing that shows you all their 500 connections that they have, or 200 connections, or 1,000 connections. And then you have all of a sudden that one donor and all the people that they are linked to. And so you can look through those people and go, oh my goodness, so-and-so is the executive vice president of X, Y, and Z, or so-and-so has done this. Could you introduce me to them? And most people are delighted to do that. So if you have like 50 names in terms of your board or your individual donors or anyone that you can put into LinkedIn, they are part of an ecosystem of thousands, and it's a way of informing your approach.
Great, Catherine, can you move it to the next slide just for contact information? I think a couple people have asked if they can see that.
Sure.
And then the last question, or a couple of questions, you mentioned the return on investment success tools. Can you, will you be able to send those links to me and I can send them out to the group that was here? Okay, perfect. And then the final question is more for Shannon. Are there specific opportunities with the Shelter Foundation directly, or are all opportunities local realtor generated? For example, they have a yard sale, the local shelter receives that amount.
Right. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So at a kind of a national corporate level, Royal LePage Shelter Foundation does not have any undesignated funding, and so we don't give out grants, and we're not able to actually respond to individual requests for funding. What we do is we ideally partner the local Royal LePage office with a shelter in their community, and then whatever those, you know, we certainly can't mandate their involvement. I wish I could say, okay, every realtor in the country needs to sign up to be a commission donor and everyone needs to be holding golf tournaments and galas. We can't really do that. What we do is we try and encourage them, and we have certain tools and certain incentives to get them involved. But the idea is that the local Royal LePage office is partnered with their local shelter, and then we try and get them involved. So if you're a shelter on the call and you've said, look, I've never heard of this before, I don't know anything to do with Royal LePage, I mean, the first thing is, first of all, to see if there's a Royal LePage office even in your community, because we don't cover every single community. And you can look at royallepage.ca, royallepage.ca, and you can look up to see if there's an office in your community. And then you can certainly get in touch with me, and I can try and facilitate that relationship. It's, again, a relationship building process. And I can see if there's a way of matching you if that office does not have a current shelter partner. We usually try and make it exclusive, like one Royal LePage office, one shelter partner, so they can really feel like that strong bond. In some cases, we may have a couple of different shelters supported by a single Royal LePage office, or we might have a shelter supported by multiple offices. But that's generally how it works. And then we also do some fundraising at some of our events that are realtor-specific events. That's how we raise the money that we donate to the Canadian Women's Foundation and to Women's Shelters Canada for the violence prevention work. But other than that, there's no sort of direct access for the shelters to come to me at the foundation to request funding. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yep. Oh, we've got another for Catherine. Are there shelter cases for support that you'd be willing to share? Is there an opportunity to set up a resource sharing initiative amongst shelters?
Terrific question. And I think that it would be, I think that it's in the, Women's Shelters Canada is interested in creating a community of practice around best practice in fundraising, and I think it's a superb idea, because as I said from the outset, I've had some involvement, but in terms of what's around the table, it's much deeper and wider in terms of people's own experience, and to have a resource for associate members where they can go and look at what does a best practice look like in terms of a really particularly effective direct mail piece, or what is a best practice around an event sponsorship package, or a particular kind of event that worked well in one market. Because what shelters have is a very interesting aggregate is that you work in your own markets by and large, but the kind of work that you do is very similar across markets. And so there's an opportunity, if there's a fantastic event that is done in PEI, that it can be replicated just as easily in Prince George. And so the creation of a community of practice is something that is on the radar for Women's Shelters Canada, and I think it's a terrific idea. I'm happy to start that piece in terms of some case for supports or particular ways of presenting impact or annual reports that I've come across that are quite powerful, but the depth and breadth of that is from you guys and your own experience across the country, and I think Women's Shelters Canada is going to be looking at how to be able to aggregate that information from its members and to post that in a way that we can all learn from each other.
Yeah, this is Caitlin here from Women's Shelters Canada, just to say that we are looking into options of having this type of information available on our website, perhaps in a section that would be just for associate members. So we'll be working with Catherine on having those resources available. And I don't see any more questions coming in, and we are over the time, so I think maybe I'll just let Lise thank everybody. I'm going to put you back on your webcam, Lise.
Donc, merci tout le monde d'avoir participé à notre premier webinaire. J'espère que vous avez trouvé ça utile et c'est notre intention d'avoir un suivi sur ce sujet parce que c'est évident que c'est au centre de beaucoup de notre travail. So thank you everyone for having participated in this first webinar. We hope it was useful for you, and we will, you know, it is our intention to continue because, you know, as we said, like it or not, fundraising is central to the work, and it is something that most shelters don't have very many options. That being said, we will be asking questions about this in our survey, and it's also meant to strengthen the sector. So perhaps, you know, by demonstrating the importance of the funds and the support that are garnered through fundraising for allowing you to deliver your work, will encourage people in the private sector and individual donors to consider shelters as a possible place to provide, you know, philanthropists and whatnot. So we hope to continue this work together. Et donc, comme j'ai dit, on espère continuer ce travail ensemble et que l'information qui va sortir de notre questionnaire pourra aussi vous aider dans cette partie de votre travail. Donc, merci et bonne fin de journée. Thanks and have a good rest of day.